Every place on our planet has a story to tell of life, landscape, man, and the connections between them that stretch across space and time. This is the world as you've never seen it before. An immense gash in the Earth's crust, born of elemental violence. A primordial world of spectacular volcanoes, barren wastelands, and vast bottomless lakes. The Great Rift Valley of East Africa. 3,500 miles long, slicing south from Ethiopia to Mozambique. 35 million years old, and still growing. It sparked an explosion of life of every kind. Not to mention being the birthplace of humanity. The rift is the common thread connecting all these things. To see how a geological event has made this possible, we have to go back in time. 35 million years ago, deep below what is now Ethiopia. "2,000 miles down, close to the molten core of the Earth, extreme heat and pressure forced a bubble of liquid rock up toward the surface, where it swelled against the Earth's crust like a blister. But a blister 1,000 miles wide. It tore the landscape apart. This is what remains of that ancient upheaval. A volcanic wasteland in northeast Africa that overlaps Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti. The Danakil Depression. Here, the Earth's crust has been so stretched and mangled by the rifting process that the whole landscape has sunk like a souffle. In places, down to 500 feet below sea level. Cooling breezes can't get in. The heat can't get out. The Danakil Depression is the hottest place on Earth. It's hard to believe that only 30,000 years ago, a mere blink in geological time, this vast empty bowl was filled with seawater. But it was. Then the rift threw up a chain of volcanoes that cut it off from the rest of the ocean. In the unrelenting heat, the water gradually evaporated away. But it left something behind. Salt. The rift brought the salt, and the salt brought the Afar. The desert Afar people have been coming here to mine salt for 2,000 years. In hot climates, before there were refrigerators for preserving meat, salt was a treasured commodity. It was used as money in East Africa for thousands of years. The Afar call it white gold. There are 25 square miles of it here, and in places, it's 250 feet thick. The heat and stillness of this broad, sunken salt pan make it a brutal workplace. By 11 a.m., it's already over 100 degrees. The sodium chloride is so pure, it doesn't need any refining. It's ready to be used as is, as a preservative or just table salt. It can take a week to get it to market, 100 miles away, in the town of Asaida. A 7-day journey through a place where for 9 months out of the year, it doesn't rain at all. The Afar call the Danakil Depression the gateway to hell. For the Afar's pack animals, things may not be quite so bad. Camels are perfectly suited to the hostile conditions of the rift. They can tolerate a body temperature of 106 degrees, something that would kill most other animals, including us. To the relief of their masters, no doubt, camels don't sweat much, which conserves precious water. Their nostrils absorb and recycle moisture that would otherwise be lost when they exhale. But sometimes even camels need to drink. So do the Afar. And what the Great Rift takes with one hand, it gives with the other. The same geology that makes this place so hot and dry also supplies the key to survival here: water. If you know where to look. Because the rifting process that created this otherworldly landscape in the first place never stopped. It may seem counterintuitive, but the constant volcanic activity in this area is a thirsty traveler's best friend. A lattice work of subterranean fissures in the volcanic rock means that water seeps into the most unlikely places. Aquifers and hot springs are hidden throughout the Danakil Depression. For centuries, fathers have passed on the secret of their location to their sons. Drinking this mineral-rich volcanic water has also had an unexpected cosmetic result for these sturdy salt miners. Turns out, there's a lot of fluoride in the water. In small doses, fluoride strengthens teeth, but large amounts actually soften them, helping the Afar with a tradition that may set your own teeth on edge. For countless centuries, Afar men have chiseled their teeth to crocodile points. It's considered a sign of both resilience and a stoic indifference to pain, in a land where you need both. In Africa's Great Rift Valley, everything is connected to something else. It's the region's unusual geology that produces the high fluoride water, which in turn makes possible the Afar's crocodile teeth. And the rift also gives rise to a fashion statement of a very different kind. A 1,000 miles south of the Danakil Depression, there's a cluster of lakes right in the heart of the Rift Valley. Very unusual lakes. Here in Lake Bogoria, volcanic heat and pressure force steam up through deep bedrock. As the steam makes its tortured way towards the surface, it leaches chemicals from the rock. Not just fluoride, but caustic compounds, like sodium carbonate. The alkaline waters of these soda lakes are so corrosive, they burn your skin off. But one creature's toxic pool is another's 5-star restaurant. Lesser flamingos. They're here to eat the algae that abound in these waters. Algae that are here because they thrive in that corrosive alkaline water. A flamingo's beak is designed to filter the algae from the mud. Just how becomes clear underwater. The flamingo pumps lake water in and out of its beak 20 times a second. Lining the beak are feathery hairs designed to trap the microscopic algae cells. The cells contain reddish-colored pigments called beta-carotenes. And that's what puts the pink in pink flamingos. Flamingos are born with white or light gray feathers. It's their algae diet from the rift's soda lakes that gives them their signature color. Needless to say, the silent partner in this strange transaction is the Great Rift itself. But neither these lakes, nor the Rift Valley's even more spectacular Great Lakes, would exist at all, were it not for an event of incalculable violence that took place 30 million years ago. When the Great Rift tore through East Africa millions of years ago, the land gave way without protest, until an extraordinary thing happened. The continent of Africa fought back. The rift had carved its way south for over 10 million years. But then this unstoppable force met an immovable object. An ancient and extremely hard piece of the Earth's crust called a craton. The rift was forced to split in two and go around it. To the east, where the subterranean violence was most intense, volcanoes and earthquakes tormented the landscape. While on the western side of the craton, the relentless faulting opened up deep canyons, which filled with water. Today, these are the Great Lakes of Africa. Victoria, Malawi, Tanganyika. These vast lakes hold a quarter of the world's fresh surface water, which drains into them from the neighboring highlands. When a rift canyon 420 miles long fills with water, this is what you get. Lake Tanganyika, the longest freshwater lake in the world and Africa's deepest. If you include the massive layer of sediment at the bottom, Lake Tanganyika is 4 times deeper than the Grand Canyon. An enormous lake, rich in organic nutrients. It's not surprising that there are a lot of fish in Lake Tanganyika. A lot of fish. Which is why people have lived on these shores since ancient times. 1 million locals depend on fishing for their livelihoods. Every day, fishermen pull hundreds of tons of freshwater sardines out of Lake Tanganyika. They're known as daga. No need for refrigeration here. The intense tropical sun functions as a natural preservative, quickly drying the little fish. Now they'll keep for months. Daga provide 40% of the protein eaten in this region. After thousands of years of constant fishing, there are still huge numbers of daga in Lake Tanganyika. Even more impressive is the number of different species they share the lake with. The African Great Lakes contain the richest diversity of fish in the world. To see why things turned out this way, we have to turn back the clock again, to the distant past. The rift created Lake Tanganyika, Africa's oldest lake, 20 million years ago. But 3 million years ago, when the most recent ice age began to grip the planet, water levels fell so drastically that Lake Tanganyika divided into separate, smaller lakes. The fish in each of the now isolated lakes began to evolve independently. From just one original type of fish, called a cichlid, hundreds of new subspecies arose. Then, as the climate of the rift entered a wet period, Lake Tanganyika filled up again. Suddenly, all the new kinds of cichlids shared a single habitat. They had to compete for the same limited food supplies. So each species of fish, out of sheer desperation, developed its own survival tactics. Tactics that became increasingly bizarre. These fish may look the same, but there are actually two species here. One is a spy. It has adapted to look just like the other, so it can infiltrate the school and get close enough to snack on the other species' scales. Tricky fish. Another species of cichlid developed a vacuum cleaner mouth to suck up nutritious algae from the rocks. And because big fish eat little fish, some mothers have developed a cunning way to keep their offspring close to home. Very close. It was dramatic shifts in the climate of the Rift Valley that caused the explosion in cichlid species and led to the startling variety of fish there are today in the African Great Lakes. But changes in the weather, coupled with the rift's ongoing geological upheavals, would have other consequences, far more profound consequences, for another species entirely: us. Much of the Rift Valley was a very different place. Virgin rainforest. A nice place. But if it had stayed that way, we humans would never have evolved. Apes thrived in the humid forest canopy. When necessary, they came down from the trees and traveled on all fours. But then, 4.4 million years ago, right here in the Great Rift Valley, a new species came along. In Ethiopia in 1992, a team of paleoanthropologists found the bones of the earliest member of the human family to be discovered so far. They called her Ardipithecus ramidus, or Ardi for short. Ardi could walk upright on two legs. This is the single most important feature distinguishing humans from apes. But Ardi was an early hominid. She was only a part-time walker. Mostly, she and the other primates stayed in the forest canopy and got around by swinging from tree to tree. But Ardipithecus ramidus was just a glimpse of things to come. After Ardi's time, a group of more advanced hominids passed through the rift's Olduvai Gorge in the shadow of an erupting volcano. Over millennia, the evidence of their journey was covered in layers of ash and rain and set like cement. These fossilized footprints were uncovered in 1978. The ape men who made them, Australopithecus afarensis, were way ahead of Ardi physiologically. Their feet were made for walking. The footprints left no doubt that these hominids walked upright, not just occasionally, but all the time. They had to. The rift gave them no choice. To see why, we have to travel even further back in time, to a radical upheaval that had started 3 million years earlier. The rift threw up a great range of mountains in central East Africa. The moist westerly winds now ran right into a massive barrier, triggering torrential rain to the west of the mountains. Eastern side with barely any rain at all, in what's called a rain shadow. Without water, the forest to the east of the rift began to die. Thick woodlands became scattered clumps of trees. No longer could the apes swing through the dense rainforest canopy to find food. There was no canopy. If they wanted to eat, their only option was to go to ground. Adapting to walk efficiently and full-time allowed Australopithecus to roam much further in search of food and water than the other apes of the Rift Valley. What had been a minor sideline for the ape men of Ardi's era turned into a necessity, and it gave Australopithecus a critical evolutionary advantage. Without this decisive advance, our early ancestors here in the rift would have been unprepared for what nature threw at them next. Starting about 3 million years ago, around the time Australopithecus was leaving those famous footprints, there was a change in the weather. A big change. In a relatively short time, vast glaciers spread over the Earth's poles, sucking moisture from the equator, and then, just as quickly, receded. These cycles would continue for hundreds of thousands of years. Only a creature that could figure out how to adapt quickly to a constantly changing environment could survive. And over time, that's exactly what our ancestors did. Around 2 million years ago, a new kind of primate emerged here in the Rift Valley, Homo erectus. They'd lost most of their ape body hair, which made it easier for them to stay cool through sweating. Their brains had grown to twice the size of early ape men. They began to scavenge for meat. The ability to control fire led them to settle in temporary dwelling places. The survival strategies Homo erectus pioneered would be critical to our evolution. Today, traces of our early history can be seen in modern tribes like the Hadza of northern Tanzania. The Hadza are among the last hunter-gatherers in the world. Once we learned how to hunt, we began to control the supply of meat, rather than depending on the chance discovery of an animal carcass. And once we began to eat meat on a regular basis, the stage was set for our evolution into modern human beings. Having mastered fire, we could cook the meat we hunted, which meant we could digest it more easily. All this happened right here in the Rift Valley, and the result was the much larger brain of today's humans. Cooperative hunting and communal eating helped us become more social. And because we were getting more calories with less effort than it took to gather nuts and berries, we had more time to socialize. All of which was key to us becoming us. Homo sapiens sapiens. But the animals early man had begun to depend on for food in the Rift Valley were only available to him because of the food available to them, which is why the most ordinary plant of all was able to change the course of history. Grass. Most of us think of it as something we have to mow. And yet, an entire chain of cause and effect depends on this simple plant. A food chain. The herbivores need the grass to eat. And the carnivores, well, you know what they eat. There's a lot riding on the grass. Fortunately for the food chain of the Serengeti, grass does quite well here, thanks to the geology of the Rift Valley. These high plains were pushed up when the rift formed 10 million years ago. The legacy of that violent process actually makes the grass grow, or at least grow greener. But in the Great Rift, rain is a fickle mistress. For much of the year, vast tracts of the Serengeti are bone dry. The plains are so vast that rain falls in different places at different times, according to the seasons. And so the animals must travel to find greener pastures. The Serengeti's ceaseless tide of weather drives millions of grazing animals on the greatest migration of wildlife on the planet. They follow the greening of the grass. But grass doesn't give up its nutritional treasures without a fight. It contains too much cellulose, which is almost impossible for most animals to break down chemically. But grazers like the wildebeest are uniquely equipped to digest the indigestible. They are ruminants. First, they chew. They chew for a while. Then they swallow the grass, not into their stomachs, but into a large chamber called the rumen. Here's where the magic happens. Bacteria in the rumen break down the grass and transform the pulp into protein. The cud is regurgitated for a final chew. And then it's swallowed again, this time into the main stomach. A protein-rich meal from virtually nothing. But even this digestive miracle would be for naught without one last link in the chain. Enter the humble dung beetle. This tiny creature likes to roll the wildebeest's dung into neat little balls, push them into tunnels, and lay eggs in them. When the larvae eat their way out, they just happen to break down the dung, releasing nitrogen and phosphorus into the soil, without which the grass here simply wouldn't flourish as it does. A deep and natural interconnectedness has been an essential part of the Great Rift Valley from time immemorial. But there came a time when the valley's ancient resilience was sorely tested by the hand of man. The Rift Valley is home to more nomadic tribes than any other part of Africa. Herdsmen, like the Maasai, roam the plains of Kenya and northern Tanzania with their cattle. Wildebeest, zebra, and elephants aren't the only animals that need to follow the rains to find fresh grass. Cattle are to the Maasai tribesmen what money in the bank is to us. But wandering the open savanna puts their assets at risk from predators like big cats and hyenas. The rift itself provides the Maasai with a defense: the unassuming acacia tree. The Maasai use the acacia's spiky branches as a kind of natural barbed wire to fashion cattle pens. Very effective cattle pens. The acacia evolved these vicious thorns to defend itself against hungry herbivores. Though some have found ways to break through those defenses. The giraffe, in particular, has brought a unique finesse to the problem. Its tongue is 20 inches long and so able to snake around the spikes to get to the tasty leaves within. The acacia keeps the Maasai's cattle safe from wild animals. But once these herds were under threat from even more dangerous predators. Rival tribes out to steal them. The Maasai defended their livelihood vigorously. And over time, earned a reputation as fearsome warriors. They began to raid other tribes' cattle and territory. By the 1850s, the Maasai controlled most of the central Rift Valley. But soon they'd be humbled by an enemy they never even had the chance to resist. Because in the mid-19th century, Europeans were arriving here in droves. Colonial invaders had been exploiting Africa's natural treasures for centuries, elsewhere on the continent. The Portuguese had come in the 1400s to plunder Africa's gold. In the 17th century, the Dutch seized land in South Africa and built fruit plantations. Soon, all the other European colonial powers scrambled to grab a slice of the action. But in the east, the Rift Valley lay unclaimed. The Europeans didn't know exactly what they'd find here, just that they wanted it. But they brought with them foreign viruses. A plague called rinderpest decimated the Maasai's cattle. And smallpox felled the people of the rift. By 1900, smallpox had wiped out as many as 2/3 of the Maasai. Their dominance of the Rift Valley shrank back down to a small corner of what it had been just 50 years earlier. Facing little resistance from the weakened native population, the Europeans set their minds to the exploitation of the Rift Valley's natural resources. They found that the most valuable prize was simply there for the taking: ivory. Demand was huge. In the late 1800s, up to 100,000 elephants were killed every year. Their tusks were made into everything from knife handles to billiard balls to piano keys. Arab traders dominated the ivory business. They enslaved millions of Africans and forced them to carry the ivory to the coast, where both the ivory and the slaves were sold. But the British had their own plans for turning the Rift Valley into a money-making concern. They wanted to transform the fertile expanses into farmland. To get farmers in and produce out, they decided to build a railroad from the coast into the heart of the continent. It seemed like a good idea at the time. The line was supposed to stretch 800 miles from the port of Mombasa in Kenya to the British colony of Uganda in Central Africa. But the project was cursed from the start. Because there were no skilled railroad workers in Africa, the British imported them from another of their colonies, India. Almost immediately, they began to suffer from the most virulent form of a parasitic disease endemic to the Rift Valley: sleeping sickness. Thousands died, so many that the corpses couldn't be properly buried, which led to another grave development. A pair of lions was drawn to the smell. They developed a taste for human flesh. In 9 months, the lions picked off more than 100 men, live ones. Terrified workers deserted in droves, until finally, the lions were tracked down. But the British hadn't even gotten to the engineering challenge yet. Crossing the highlands of the Great Rift itself, a tumbled mass of steep hills and enormous chasms. Thousands of tons of solid rock had to be dug out to lay a bed for the tracks. In the end, the construction costs proved too steep, doubling from $250 to nearly $500 million in today's money. Back home in England, the project had long since been known as the Lunatic Line. After struggling against the rift for 582 miles, the British finally threw in the towel in 1901, 200 miles short of the finish line. And yet, despite the failure of the Lunatic Line, the attempt to build it had a lasting, if unexpected, consequence. Before they surrendered to the defiant power of the rift, construction crews had built a supply depot on a spot the Maasai called the Place of Cool Waters. In their language, Nairobi. Today, what was once an insignificant rail depot is home to 3 million people. It's Kenya's capital and the most populous city in East Africa. A modern metropolis like Nairobi needs a lot of power. But because it sits nestled within the Great Rift, up to 20% of its energy needs can be supplied from geothermal sources. Because the volcanic forces that shaped the Rift Valley at its birth are still at work deep underground. And yet the future of the rift will be one of even greater cataclysm. In Northeast Africa, right where the rift began 35 million years ago, 3 tectonic plates continue to tear apart. Already, cracks are widening in the landscape. But they're just a hint of what's to come. Fast forward 10 million years. Eventually, the Great Rift will cleave through the continent. Seawater will invade from the north, and the Horn of Africa will be wrenched off, reborn as an island in a brand new ocean which already has a name, the Afar Ocean. Everything we know as the Rift Valley will have vanished.